I personally haven't used ChatGPT much, but despite some of the immensely impressive things it can do. So after listening to an episode I did about the set theoretic multiverse, my dad had ChatGPT write a sestina about Hilbert's Hotel. I have the sense that in general, we wouldn't consider it capable of passing the Turing test at this point. And again, for those who aren't familiar with it, what I have in mind here is just whether or not somebody could communicate with ChatGPT unknowingly, maybe, and be unable to tell whether or not it's human. But at this point, do you think it is particularly far off from that?
I think there are many situations in which you wouldn't be able to tell it isn't human. I mean, if you know ChatGPT and you know the kind of rather anodyne kinds of prose that it tends to produce, you might say, hey, that's a bot.
Uh-huh.
But I think in many situations, you're doing some, chat customer service interaction with somebody. I'm not sure you'd be able to tell. And I think, it depends. Right. If you probe it in certain ways and you see, well, it's giving kind of a bland answer to this, it's like, that's probably a machine because it's, most people would be a little bit more, would have a little bit less blandness to their answer. But I think it's in terms of language as a kind of, it's a pretty good simulation of what we humans produce as language, up to some level of kind of originality, creativity, and so on. It's as I said, it's a little bland relative to what folks like me aspire to in terms of the things one writes.
Well, the reason that I ask, and I promise that I'm heading somewhere, it's a bit more abstract than just ChatGPT, but I wonder whether you think we would be willing to call something like ChatGPT, maybe like a future iteration of it, intelligent, simply because it was indistinguishable from a human interlocutor in a case where we are probing it with more intention, whether to determine whether or not this is the case.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is always, it's sort of a disease of philosophy, right? You have a word like intelligence, and you say, do you consider it intelligent? Well, it's kind of just a word. And, the question is, what comes with that word?
Exactly.
And, what does it, I have to say, in by way of personal history and things in philosophy, my mother was a philosophy professor in Oxford. And so I was exposed in my early life to lots of philosophers. And I kind of, I always said, if there's one thing I'll never do when I'm grown up, it's be a philosopher. And hasn't quite panned out exactly that way. But this was always a thing which, somehow in conversations, the very young me would have with the at that time I thought ancient philosophers, but probably younger than me now, it would often come up, there's some word, there's something, what is X? And it always kind of drove me crazy because it's like, it's just a word. And, words come with a certain baggage of what they might mean to people, which you kind of have to have a consequence to that word to really lock in, what are you really talking about? So in terms of intelligence, I've been interested in kind of what is intelligence, so to speak? What is intelligence versus what is merely computational? And I think one thing that is true of kind of, you don't get something that we'd reasonably call intelligence without some level of computational sophistication.
Right.
If you've got a thing that's just repeating, periodically doing the same thing, you're not going to end up calling it intelligent. But there are, one of the things I've been interested in from a science point of view is what are the levels of computational sophistication of different kinds of systems? And you might have thought, a brain, it's got all this sophisticated stuff in it. A modern computer, it's got all this sophisticated stuff in it. It must be computationally more sophisticated than some simple abstract system, than some system in nature, things like this. One of the big consequences of a whole bunch of science I've done is that no, there aren't different levels of computational sophistication. Once you get above some threshold, there's this kind of principle of computational equivalence that I came up with that kind of implies that there's this sort of vast equivalence between the kinds of computations different things can do. So it's kind of like the old statement, the weather has a mind of its own. That's, in this way of thinking about things, the weather is computationally as sophisticated as brains, which are correspondingly computationally at the same level as even simple abstract, rule-based systems and so on. And so, I think that this base level, this sort of underlying requirement of what counts as intelligent versus merely computational versus, you have to have this layer of computational sophistication before you can reasonably get to this point. I mean, I would say, just as a matter of sort of a footnote, of perhaps amusing footnote, this whole question about what is intelligent versus what is merely computational, which you might say, well, that's sort of a philosophical question. For me personally, that became at some point in my life an incredibly practical question, because I've been long interested, ever since I was a kid, actually, in kind of, can one take knowledge in the world and kind of make it what I would now say computational? It's not the term I used back in those days, but can you make it kind of something where you can automatically answer questions? Well, back in the mid-aughts, I kept on revisiting this question, and I had always thought to make something which was a good sort of expert answerer of questions according to the corpus of knowledge that we have in our civilization, that we would necessarily have to build kind of a brain-like thing, a general artificial intelligence kind of thing. But after I developed this principle of computational equivalence, kind of came back to that question, I said, look, this principle of computational equivalence says there isn't really a bright line of the intelligent versus the merely computational. So I have no excuse for not trying to actually build a practical system that does this kind of question answering. And so it wasn't clear it was possible, but, we started building that. And indeed, we built Wolfram Alpha and so on. And turns out it was possible. And so this idea that there isn't kind of a spark of intelligence different from the merely computational, for me, had this very practical consequence. And I think, perhaps the thing we built gives a little bit more evidence that, no, there isn't really this huge distinction. And I think now with ChatGPT and so on, we have another sort of piece of evidence that the merely computational, that there isn't some sort of spark of difference between the intelligent and the merely computational. But I think the other thing to realize is, what is the difference between us and the random, simple, rule-based system, the weather, whatever else? The answer is a ton of kind of specialized, kind of the way that we are versus the way generic computation is. And that isn't something that seems to be a different level. It just seems to be a different set of particulars. We have the particular set of words in our language. We have the particular collection of common sense knowledge based on kind of our experience of the world, our sensory experience, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are things that we have that are particulars. They're not a matter, I think, of, we are better than the weather or something like that. We are just have different particulars which lead us to have, to experience something where we've got this kind of, these computational things are things that have sort of human-like characteristics, and other things might be just as, quotes, intelligent, but not human-like.
So I'm particularly curious about when you were saying that there was no line that you could determine between the intelligent and the computational. And what I'm wondering is, when you began, you said that you pointed out that intelligence is just a word. And are you explaining in explaining that there is no line between the intelligent and the computational, is that to say that there is nothing really substantive behind the word intelligence?
Right. I mean, so I think, yes, I think the answer to that is yes, that's what I'm saying. Now, a thing that I've realized only in the last couple of years, 3 years or so, through a very circuitous route, I've realized when, I'd always thought, you talk about consciousness, I'm always like, that's a horrifying term. I don't know what it means. It's all mushy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But because I've been interested in fundamental physics and understanding kind of how we build the whole universe computationally, so to speak, and how that works and how to think about that. One of the things that's come out of that, which I think is an incredibly beautiful piece of, I don't know whether you call it science or philosophy or something else, is this kind of ability to derive kind of the laws of physics as we know them. But that derivation, and we can talk about it in more detail, but that derivation is kind of you start with kind of this thing, we call it the Roolead, this entangled limit of all possible computational processes. It's kind of this unique kind of object that encapsulates everything possible computationally. And then the question is, how are we, as observers of that, how are we sampling that thing? And the answer is, we have certain characteristics. We have certain specific characteristics as observers. One of the characteristics is actually the opposite of saying we've got lots of computational sophistication. It's that we're actually computationally bounded. We don't get to follow every detail, work through every computation that's going on in the Roolead. We are just sort of sampling the small pieces. Kind of like if we are looking at something like, molecules bouncing around in a gas, we don't follow every individual molecule. We simply sample some aggregate properties of the gas. And the whole point is that we're sort of limited in our computational abilities. It is not that we are more powerful in the universe. We're in a sense a subset of what the universe could provide. And turns out that kind of narrowing is critical to the fact that we observe the laws of physics that we observe. I mean, there's another criterion that's necessary for deriving the structure of space-time and the structure of quantum mechanics, which is an interesting thing, which is, in addition to us being computationally bounded observers, that we're also observers who believe we are persistent in time. And that's a thing that is kind of, even though we might be made of different atoms of space at every successive moment, we believe that there is a continuity to our thread of experience. And that belief kind of feeds into the way that we understand how the universe works. But so to this question about, is intelligence, or something that we might intuitively think of as intelligence, is it merely computational? I would say I would add the footnote. It's actually a bit of a subset of all possible computation, so to speak. We have these features like our belief in persistence in time, like our boundedness in terms of the computation we can do relative to all the computation that can happen in the universe. So, I mean, those are specifics, but I think beyond that, the thing that makes us, what is human-like intelligence versus what is intelligence in the abstract. And I think human-like intelligence has a lot of features of kind of our details as humans. And that's what you might mean when you say intelligence is kind of human-like intelligence. I think that as soon as you get beyond the kind of human-like intelligence to something more general, you're pretty much thrown into this sort of vast ocean of what's computationally possible.
And I just want to make sure that I heard you correctly. You said that a few minutes ago that whether or not there is really something substantive behind intelligence, you said that the intuition behind what we mean by the intelligent is captured by a subset of the computational. Is that roughly what I heard you say?
Well, okay. So I think human-like intelligence is a subset of what is computationally possible.
Okay.
If you ask me about non-human-like intelligence, I'm not quite sure what to say.
Okay, sure.
I'd like to, that's where we should bring your cat into the conversation.
Yes.
It's
but no, this is exactly what I was wondering. And returning to my initial question that sort of sparked this, it wasn't really a digression, but this talk about what intelligence is. Do you think then that passing the Turing test, in which a human is trying to probe and determine whether or not the being it's speaking with is a human, does passing that confirm that it is, that what it's speaking with is part of this subset of the computational that characterizes human intelligence?
What is it like to be human-like? Well, we can say it's really important that you have two eyes, that you walk in this way, that you respond to an optical illusion in this way. I think that if you say is this thing truly human-like? Then the answer is, if it's a bunch of semiconductor, things, it's not truly human-like. When you say, is it human-like at the level of being kind of intelligent like a human, there are lots of frayed edges. I mean, it's going to have, you can have a conversation with it about mortality, for example, and it might just, in the case of an LLM, it's going to parrot what it read on the web about mortality. But in terms of, you can push it in such a direction that, the fact that it isn't physically like a human is going to become evident. And then you'll say, well, it's not human-like. But yeah, well, that's because it's not a human, so to speak. So I think I think that if you say, is it, defining, Alan Turing's narrow kind of version of nice, but narrow version of, what it might be like to be able to tell, is this a human-like intelligence? I'm not sure what we would conclude beyond, yes, it's a human-like intelligence as defined by the Turing test, so to speak. Does that mean that it's truly human-like in all respects? Obviously not.
Okay. This is where I wanted to go, because granted that you never wanted to be a philosopher, there is an interesting paper in the Philosophy of Mind by the philosopher Ned Block. Are you familiar with this idea of the quote unquote the blockhead?
Nope.
Okay, well,
educate me.
Yeah, sure. It's an attack on this behaviorist conception of intelligence, so that we could determine whether something is intelligent, or even maybe you'd be more sympathetic to intelligent in a human sense, just by observing its behavior and without any reference to its internal processes. And the argument is supported by, and I think really demonstrated through, a thought experiment that involves this machine called the Blockhead. And we are told to imagine a team of researchers with infinite time and budget, and you might want to object to that immediately, but they draft up all of the possible sensible conversations that could transpire between two people in, say, an hour, just for the sake of a reasonable rendition of the Turing test. And these conversations are structured kind of like a play. So in terms of input and output, you have like respondent, terminal, then this corresponds to input and output. And they then set up this machine, which has hence been known as the Blockhead, so that it takes the initial input that's typed into it by the participant in the Turing test at the computer terminal, and then it combs through its database of all of these conversations, and it selects a conversation that begins with precisely that string, and then it outputs the next response. And the participant responds, and then the Blockhead, it again...
Yeah, I understand. It's enumerated all possible conversations, and it can just match it up.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that's a kind of an idealized picture of what an LLM does.
Right. And except of course the LLM it's generative in a certain way, and it has much more sophisticated pattern recognition. But the idea is that the Blockhead, because we know how it works from the outside, we know that it is not at all anything we would consider intelligent, but it still will pass the Turing test as regularly and predictably as a human. And this argument is supposed to demonstrate that we cannot determine whether something is intelligent at all behaviorally.
So I think that the key thing that's being missed there is the phenomenon of computational irreducibility, which people tend to, actually, since I invented this concept in the early 80s, there is actually a decent philosophical literature about it. And but it is something that will be seen as increasingly important in understanding kind of how the world works. It's kind of a foundational idea in thinking about how the world works. And what it has to do with is, the rules by which something operates. But the question is, does that then mean you know everything about the thing? And the point is that what one discovers is that it can be it can require an irreducible amount of computation. If you want to know what is the system going to do after 1 billion steps, well, you can just run the 1 billion steps of the computation and find out. But is there a way to jump ahead? Is there a way to computationally reduce things? And that's what, a lot of kind of the science that started in the late 1600s and so on, the kind of mathematicized science, is all about, look, we can predict, we can jump ahead of the actual operation of the system and say what's going to happen. But it turns out that there are a great many systems, in fact, any of these systems that show this kind of computational equivalence property, there are a great many systems where you can't do that kind of jumping ahead. So when you say, oh, we're just going to enumerate this finite collection of conversations and so on, well, yes, in that box, you can say, sure, you can tell if you only talk to it for 15 minutes, you can have enumerated all those conversations. But if you consider the unbounded case of what's it going to do eventually, what's it ever going to do, that's what you realize is, yes, you may know the rules, but that doesn't tell you it doesn't, you think, because I know how this thing was constructed, that therefore you've kind of nailed everything about it. And in the particular thing you're talking about, because it's of finite length, you can kind of just enumerate all the cases. You don't have to worry about kind of unbounded computations and so on. That's, take away that restriction. You don't get to say, oh, we can just enumerate all these cases and know that they're sitting there in the box, so to speak. Then you have to start saying, well, I've got this team of experts and they're enumerating these things. And look, I can see these experts are just using rules. And these rules, they seem very simple. They don't seem consistent with there being a magic spark of intelligence there. But the truth is that all, from what we've figured out about physics, for example, all the way down, it's just simple rules. So when we say, well, we just, as soon as you can say, look, I can see these rules, they're simple. Look, there's no spark of intelligence here. Well, that's our universe. And this phenomenon of computational irreducibility is what kind of irreducibly separates the actual behavior we see from the sort of external description of, look, we put these rules in, and all we're getting is these rules we put in, so to speak. So I think the mistake there is, the key conceptual mistake is not thinking about computational irreducibility, not thinking about just because you know the rules, you say, therefore I know everything. That's just not right. And, so, that would be my response.